I want to talk to you today about clusters. Clusters are very simply described as groups that come together because of a common interest. First of all, let's establish what a cluster is. Formal definition by an academic always helps, and Harvard professor Michael Porter tells us that a cluster is a geographic concentration of interconnected businesses and organisations in a particular industry that compete and also cooperate. The important elements of that definition are the geographic concentration. People are close enough to each other, they are interconnected, and they compete and also can collaborate and do collaborate. Businesses with similar or complementary interests, skills, competencies and needs will congregate and collaborate, particularly in small and relatively isolated cities like Adelaide. Small, 1.2 million population, and isolated from Sydney, 1,200 kilometres, Melbourne, 800 kilometres. And these factors come together at their most productive level in the advanced manufacturing sector, and that's what this whole gathering is about: advanced manufacturing, knowledge age industry. Typical cluster will include designers, producers and manufacturers, distributors, suppliers, support services such as education, research, training, testing and verification. All of those elements come together. Now, before we go too much further, let me explain how this comes about. My background is electronic engineering, and I spent 30 or more years in the manufacturing and marketing, startup and management sector of the industry in the high technology electronics industry, and recently completed a 10-year research on the origin and development of clusters, with particular emphasis on the electronics industry in various parts of the world. It involved 300 interviews with companies and research institutions in 20 cities in 8 countries on 4 continents. Now let's look at clusters. What is their origin and how did they develop? If we go back 10,000 years ago, humans began to cultivate crops and domestic animals and to live in self-managed family and clan groups. That was probably the first time that people began to rely upon each other, to use the skills of other people to support their own limited range of capability. Those who are good with animals tended to look after the animals. Those who were better at crop management looked after crops. Sounds a bit like communism, except that there's no compulsion in this. People did this because they wanted to do it. The Industrial Revolution, which we're told started around about 1760, but by 1890, industrial districts were being reported and analysed, and these were large groups of industries, particularly in places like Manchester in England in the textile industry, and later in Birmingham in England in the mechanical engineering field. And then in 1990, Professor Michael Porter from Harvard introduced the word cluster to describe the current iteration of this coming together and collaborating and cooperating. So what is the motivation for people to form clusters and to operate within clusters? Very simply, it's in their own enlightened self-interest. They do it because it works for them. Examples of clusters that you would be familiar with. The Hollywood movie cluster started in the early 20th century. The movie industry actually started in New York in the late 19th century, but it moved to Hollywood because of good weather and open spaces, 2 things that they didn't have in New York. And by the 1920s, the movie industry was heavily concentrated in a cluster, and there were producers and directors and writers and agents all coming together because it was in their own interest to do so, because they could work with people they needed to work with. Silicon Valley developed in the mid-20th century. These days has a population of 1.5 million and 10,000 employees in the electronics industry. It's structured around Stanford University, which is the wellspring of technology that originally created that industry. But back in the mid-50s, the population of that region was 56,000 people. It was a lot like our Barossa Valley. However, it grew. Birmingham has a jewellery cluster which interestingly produces 40% of all jewellery made in the UK in a 1 square kilometre area in 1/4 of Birmingham. And given that the UK has 250,000 square kilometres of space, this is a real concentration, a cluster that's been studied and is known why it works. Adelaide has an electronics cluster with about 40% of Australia's high-tech electronics design and manufacturing in this pleasant city of ours with only 6%, less than 6% of Australia's population. Why is that so? Simply because people and technologies have spilled out from our Defence Research Centre out at Salisbury, which has been there since 1947, and created an electronics industry here. It's not the only reason, but that was one of the reasons. How do clusters develop? There's a quote from a cluster researcher in New Zealand, Professor Martin Perry. At some stage, a person or group started an activity that became a community specialisation. So it has to start somewhere. 2 or 3 people got together because they had an interest in a particular piece of technology or a particular architecture or a particular process, and they discussed it and found that they could work with each other. Some had more skills in one area, others had more skills in another area, so they combined their interests. Cluster evolution works pretty much like this. There's an exchange of interest. People come together and discuss things that interest them. By doing that, trust develops. They begin to disclose some of their knowledge to each other. This can lead to collaboration, which can then lead to interdependence between the 2 parties so that one needs the other and they both need each other. They both can do something. In the electronics industry, for example, if my background is hardware engineering and I'm doing a project or setting up to do a project, I might hire or put together some hardware engineers. I probably wouldn't get a lot of software people because I know people in the software industry, people that I've gone to school with, university, played football with, knowing that I can rely upon their capability and reliability so that that becomes interdependent. After some 2 or 3 years of doing this, I give him all of my software and he gives me any hardware elements that come to his attention. And again, from Professor Michael Porter, the cluster process is a bottom-up process. It grows from the ground up without any plan, no government organisation or subsidy. It just happens because it is in the enlightened self-interest of the parties to do so. So how do clusters develop? Specialisation requires collaboration with others, and that's a strategic decision. You are good at something, you know therefore you're not going to be working at other areas, you can subcontract those in. So specialisation requires collaboration with others who have complementary skills and facilities. Again, enlightened self-interest is the driver for that. The industrial districts that developed in the large cities during the 19th century Industrial Revolution, in places like Manchester and Birmingham and others that I mentioned. But technology clusters developed in the 20th century in small second-tier cities like Adelaide that are also remote from major populations. Now, why should those 2 factors come together and cause technology clusters to be attracted to those places? Well, examples where that has happened are Cambridge in the UK, Austin, Texas, Silicon Valley in California, Christchurch in New Zealand, it may surprise you to know, has about 35% of all of New Zealand's electronics industry in a city with 8% of its population. And it's isolated down on the South Island, away from all the smart people who live in the North Island. Let's look at some benefits of clusters. Long-term local relationships with cluster firms are based on capability and reliability, not on cost. You don't compete and hack each other to death, lowering the cost as is the typical way in which industrial age manufacturing works. You've got to produce larger and larger volumes, so the cost per unit item is lower, but we are now here talking about products and processes that rely on technology and intellectual input rather than cost. Increased productivity through specialised inputs from industry and research information are typical benefits of clusters. You find that industries will tend to move, individuals will tend to move towards where these things are happening, and the research institutions nearby, universities and the like, will tend to move into that space and provide a very valuable source of information. Small city size and isolation from major population encourages collaboration with people they know and trust from personal networks, including school, university, sports and social groups. That's absolutely fundamental to the development of clusters. And it happens, let me tell you, best in small cities like Adelaide that are small enough that you can contact people, you can have face-to-face discussions, you can know a higher proportion of people in a particular industry in a small city like Adelaide than you can in a bigger city like Sydney with its 5 million or Melbourne with its 4.5 million. I was born and brought up in Sydney. I now live here by choice because I can do the things that I want to do that I could not do in Sydney. It's too large. You can't get around and talk to enough people. Another benefit of clusters is more rapid innovation. Because cooperative development, firms and institutions compete and collaborate. So there is this competitive and collaborative effort to move things forward. And people seem to have a good understanding of who else does what in a small place, typically like Adelaide or Austin or Cambridge. A pool of trained and specialised people benefits both employers and employees. If you're an employer in a cluster environment like Adelaide and you want electronic engineers, there are large numbers of them available. They tend to float from one company to another. And if you're an employee, you have plenty of options if the company you're working for does not need you or you do not need them. There are plenty of options. Knowledge circulates most effectively over short distances through shared networks. There's a lot of research that shows that that is so. Further benefits, community awareness promotes interest of students to train for careers in growing sectors. If parents, teachers and students know that there is an electronics industry, for example, in Adelaide, then they will tend to think of that as a career rather than moving interstate. Some do, but then they come back. Governments support successful and growing industries. Tonsley, where we are today, is a good example of that. The SAMRI Health and Medical Research Institute on the new Royal Adelaide Hospital site is another example. Technology Park, set up in the 80s, now totally full. In-migration of specialist firms and individuals also increases the pool of creative contributors. There are some potential disadvantages that need to be considered in a cluster. You may be concerned about the loss of intellectual property. That is the kind of intellectual property that is registrable, that is patentable. You can rely on confidentiality or non-disclosure agreements if you choose to disclose some of your technology to another person, and that will protect you. There are joint intellectual property agreements. Fear of loss of an idea which is not registrable can be protected by a trade secret regime where your employees, for example, might sign an agreement not to compete with you if they leave you. And there are design registration and trademark opportunities, and partnership agreements can support. Clusters emerge through enlightened self-interest. Specialisation benefits from collaboration. Clusters evolve through an exchange of interests, leading to trust, which develops collaboration, which moves towards interdependence and sustainability of an industry or cluster. And businesses with complementary interests, skills and competencies and needs will collaborate. That is why clusters form. And the best clusters have emerged and developed by self-organisation in only a few small and remote cities, including Adelaide. Thank you.